Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to complete our first major project. We're going to create an application that keeps track of appointments, an appointment reminder application. We're going to go through the entire process of creating this application, from creating each initial screen, all the graphical user elements, to all of the back-end supporting behavior code in your Java classes. So I'm going to be extra thorough in this lecture. I'm going to go through every little detail because I want to make sure that you follow good process when creating an application. Good naming conventions, you write good quality code. So what I wanted to do first was provide an overview of what the application does, how it's going to work, and how we're going to complete it. So this is an application that keeps track of appointments. It's going to keep track of appointments by name, by type of appointment, and the date and the time of each appointment. So you're going to be able to name your appointment. The type is going to be things like whether it's a health doctor visit, school appointment, personal appointment, or others. We're going to have two activities in this application. The first activity, the main activity, is going to contain a table with rows that display each appointment. It's also going to allow a user to create another appointment by having a button. When you click that button, it's going to go to a second activity that allows you to create an appointment. The second activity is going to be our Add New Appointment activity screen. It's going to have an edit text for your name, so you can enter a name of an appointment. It's going to have a spinner so that you can pick the appropriate type of appointment. And it's going to have date and time pickers so that you can select the date and time. It's also going to have two buttons at the bottom, one a cancel button and one an add activity. We'll add the activity and go back to the main screen. So this is what the application is going to look like. The first screen is listed on the left. It's an appointment reminder screen. Like I said, it's a table layout with table rows that contain all of your appointments. They're organized by when you actually selected them. They're organized by date. And if the appointment is on the current date, it will display the time. So the date is displayed when they're future appointments. If you have any appointments for the current day, it will display the time. It's a table layout with specific columns for each type. And then at the bottom, you see that Add Appointment button. When you select the Add Appointment button, you're going to go to the next screen, which is displayed on the right. The right is a screen that has an edit text field at the top to enter the name, a spinner, and then two edit text fields. When you select each of those two bottom edit text fields, it's going to take you to a date picker, where you can select the date, and the second edit text field, when you click it, will take you to a time picker. And then at the bottom, you can cancel if you decide you didn't want to add an appointment, which will take you back to the main screen, or you can select the Add Appointment button, which will take you back to the main screen and add all of the data that you just entered as another appointment, and it will display in the main activity. So what we're trying to learn with this application is we're trying to bring together everything that we've studied so far, mainly all the graphical user interface stuff, as well as using a lot of different controls, how to handle events, how to organize our data, and all that type of things. So before we ever start an application, you really want to break the problem down so that you have a good understanding of the requirements. And this can include writing down the problem on paper, but it's good to organize your thoughts so that you attack the problem in a good way and you're thinking about all different scenarios. So I want to describe the problem breakdown here. Before I describe the problem breakdown, though, I do want to talk a little bit about why it's important to work in small steps. So you always want to work in small steps when you're writing code and break those problems into parts. You never want to attack an application as a whole and just start writing code. It's very problematic. You'll have a lot of issues. And as you break the application down into specific parts, small steps, after completing each step, you constantly want to test before you move on to the next step. You don't want to write 1,000 lines of code and then go and test it. That will cause a lot of issues. Mainly, you won't be able to find your bugs. It'll be harder to find your bugs. So the reason we do this, the reason we work in steps, we constantly test after each step, is because it's much easier to find and fix your problem. It's easier to isolate the problem. It's easier to salute it. If you wrote 1,000 lines of code and then you compiled it and you had a compile error, the compile error could be in any of those lines of code. It's much harder to find that error. If it's not a compile error and you run it but you have a logic error, it's much harder to find and isolate that problem. So we're going to work in small steps, and we're going to constantly test after each step before we move on to the next step. And this applies to all the applications we create in this class. And as I mentioned, you constantly want to test your code. And this again ensures that before you move to the next step, you know that your code is working. So if your code all of a sudden stops working, it's most likely the problem was in the current step that you're working on. And again, lastly, why we're doing this, we want to be very aware of using good naming conventions in writing well-structured code. It's important to do these things in the beginning because it's most likely after you get something working, you'll never go back and fix it. So keep in mind while you're writing this code that you write quality code. Stay conscious of this, and if you try to do it in the beginning, you don't have to go back and change it. So let's describe the problem breakdown for this application. First thing I want to do is I want to create the user interface for the main screen, the main activity. And what this is going to entail is first I'm going to add the text fields. The text fields are at the very top. They're going to stay a fixed format. They're never going to move. They're going to identify the columns. And when I do that, I want to make sure the text fields have good IDs, using good names for the IDs, and also utilize resources and make sure they're correct size and format. I'm then going to add my scroll view. My scroll view needs to hold the table layout because table layouts do not have their own scroll view. And so when I add more table rows than I can, the scroll view will help me be able to view all of them. I'm then going to add my table layout. My table layout is going to contain the table rows that are going to contain each appointment. I'm then going to add the button that's at the bottom of the screen, the Add Appointment screen, or Add Appointment button at the bottom. And then for all the above, like I mentioned, I'm going to utilize resources for strings. We know why that's good. I'm going to assign appropriate IDs to all of the different elements, and I'm going to add any appropriate on-click method, mainly for the button. And then I'm going to test after each step. Each one of these steps I'm going to test. I'm going to make sure it works before moving on to the next step. After I'm done with all of that, I'm going to go and create the user interface for the second screen. This is the Add Appointment screen. This is going to include adding an edit text field for the name at the top. I'm then going to add a spinner for the appointment type. I'm also going to add an edit text for the date, add an edit text for the time, and then add two buttons at the bottom for the cancel and for adding the appointment. And then I'm going to add, for all the above, I'm going to utilize resources, assign IDs, and add appropriate on-click methods. And then I'm going to test after each step. Again, I'm reiterating this because it's important. A lot of times students tend to write too much code, they don't test, and then they can't find the solution to their problem. And they can't even identify where the problem is in the code. After I'm done completing the two user interfaces, I'm going to create a helper class. This is an appointment class. It's just going to use to store the different appointments. And in the main activity, I'm going to create an array list of this appointment type to store all of my data. It's nice to create objects when you have data that's associated with something because it provides encapsulation and it's good programming technique. And when I create that class, I'm going to add the appropriate member variables and getters and setters and the appropriate constructor. I'll then start the implementation of the main activity. What this will do is mainly the Java source code is what I'll be writing here. I'll be populating the dynamic table rows with default data to ensure that it works. And before I go ahead and get the data from the second screen, I want to make sure that everything works. So I'm just going to put some default data, mainly populating the array list and then creating some dynamic table rows. I'll start the second activity to show the Add Appointment screen. And then I'll move on to the Add Appointment screen, and I will start by adding member variables that we need to use in multiple of our methods. I'll get the current date and time on the onCreate method because we want to get the current date and time right when the screen shows up, because then our date and time picker methods will be right and it will reflect the current state. I'm then going to write the onClick methods to show the date and time pickers. So whenever I selected the edit text for the date and the time, I want to pop up a time picker or a date picker. I then want to add the onClick method, so when I have the date and time picker showing, after I select a date or a time and I hit OK, I want to be able to save that data. I'll then handle the onCreate dialog, which will show the actual date and time pickers when selecting the edit text. I'll then handle the cancel button, which will basically just go back to the main activity by calling the finish method. Follow that up with handling the add appointment button, which will pass all the data back to the main screen. We'll be using the direct methods to pass the data back to screen, the put extra string methods. And then again, we're testing after each step. The last part of the implementation of the program is going to be completing the main screen implementation, which is handling non-activity result, the data coming back from the second activity, where I populate the array list and add it to the table rows and show the table rows. And so I wanted to break down the problem to show you the thought process on implementing a program. And I chose to implement it in these different steps because I thought it was the most logical order. I didn't just go ahead and complete the entire main screen before completing the second screen because I thought it was more intuitive to follow the flow of the data. So we go to the main screen, we do what we need to do, we go to the second screen, we add the data, and then we go back to the main screen to show that added data. So at this point, I'd like to start doing this and showing you the different steps, completing these steps. So our real first step is creating the Android Studio project. And we all familiar with this wizard. What I want to do is give it an application name. I'm going to name this appointment reminder. And I'm actually going to put a space in here and leave all the defaults as they are. I want to create a specific folder for this. I'm going to hit the next button. I'm going to keep this as default, minimum API level. We know why that's important. And then I'm going to just start with a base or an empty activity and keep the defaults. And I'm going to say finish. And so the first thing I want to implement is that first screen. And so the wizard created a main activity with a layout file that is empty. Well, it contains a hello world. Make sure you guys can see everything. So if I go into design view, we see our empty hello world and we want to delete that. What I want to do now is complete the rest of the steps and then test after each step. I may skip some testing because I have already written the code and I know it works. But even if I am skipping testing, you want to make sure you test after each step when writing code. So what I want to do is I want to add the text fields, then add the scroll view, followed by adding the table layout, a default table row so that we can understand the size and so forth, followed by adding the button and then utilizing resources. So I'm going to use the constraint layout. What I want to start with is I want to add my text fields. These are going to be what identifies the columns. So I'm going to use text views for my widgets. I'm going to drag down 3 of these and I want to make sure they have particular properties, but let's drag them down first. And there's going to be 3 that identify each column. For each one of these, I want to have a specific size. The size is going to be 140 dp for the width for my first text field, and the height is going to be 29. And for the second text view, I want to make sure it lines up. And before I move on to the second one, though, let's make sure I assign a proper ID. And I'm just going to name this TV text view name. Name main, how about, to identify the activity. I also want to give this utilize a resource here. So I'm going to create a new resource for the name. I'm just going to say add new resource. And I'm just going to call the name resource name. And the value is going to be name. And this will be added to the strings.xml file. And I also want to make sure that this is formatted correctly. And I want to have a particular font. So I'm going to say small. So I'm going to set the gravity to center, so that it shows up right in the center. Just like that. For my second text view, I want to, again, provide some of the same things. I want to provide a good ID. And this one I'll just call TV. This is going to be type. And then for main activity. I also want to have a certain fixed width and height, which is going to be 93 dp width, and the height's going to be same as the other text view, which is 29. And then I want to create a resource for my string value of type, which is just going to be type. And I also want to center on the gravity. Center the gravity, which is always layout gravity, which it never finds for the search. So let's find the gravity and make the center. Okay, and then the last text view, I want to make sure it lines up. And I want to now set again the ID and so forth. Here I'm going to name this TV date time main. I'm going to make this a fixed size as well. It's going to have the same height, but a different width. The width is going to be 97 dp, and the height is going to be 29. And I'm going to create a new resource for the date time. Let's make sure that this is has a slash in it. And then again, I want to center it with my gravity. Okay, so at this point I completed my first step, and I would go and test it, make sure it works and everything. But for efficiency's sakes and time, I'm going to move on to my next step. But please, please, don't take these, make sure you test after each step. So the next step would be to add my scroll view, because my scroll view is going to contain my table rows, the data of the appointments. I also want to change this to pixel before I get any trouble. Let's make sure it looks right. Okay, there we go. Now I want to add a scroll view. I'm going to drag and drop the scroll view down into this. When you drag it, it immediately makes it super large, so I got to resize it. It also adds a linear layout. I don't need that linear layout. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to go back to my scroll view, and I'm going to make sure it's a little bit smaller. Whoops. Make sure it's a little bit smaller. Line it up appropriately. We're going to have a button on the bottom. So now that I have my scroll view, I now want to add a table row inside there. So I first have to add a table layout and then a table row. So I'm just going to add that inside the scroll view itself. It added a bunch of table rows. I don't want these table rows in there. I only need one. And the reason I even need one is because I want to be able to look at the sizes. So, because most of my table rows that I'm going to create for this application are going to be dynamic, so they have to be created in the Java source code. But I want to have one in there because I'm going to use the parent layout parameters and match them. I do want to make sure that my table layout has certain parameters, which I'm going to modify right inside the XML because these two parameters don't show up. These are the shrink columns and stretch columns. And I also want to make sure the table row matches the parent for both, which I can change, or the table layout I should say, which I can change. I want the height to match the parent as well for the table layout. The table row, actually for the table layout, I don't want to match the parent for the height. I want to, for the height, wrap the content like it was. Now for the table row, I want to match the parent for both, which is good. I want to have the gravity also a certain way, center everything. So let's just do that real quick. Make sure that shows up. Whoops. So we have the gravity here. Let's just make sure that it's center vertical, center horizontal, and center. And that should be good. Now inside my table row, I want to have 3 text views because that's going to contain each column. So I want to go to the text. I want to drag down a text view widget inside of my table view. And I added it to the table layout accidentally, so let's put it in the table row. Let's make sure we follow that correctly. Put it right in the table row. Okay, here's my text view. Sometimes it's hard to select. I want to make sure we select it. Drag that down to the name And this is going to have the same type of properties of the other text views. Let's set some properties first, though. Let's call it. Let's just call text view 5 is fine. Well, let's call it name table world text view, and let's make sure that this is for the width. I want to make it 93 because I want to match the name, and for the height, I'm just going to say wrap content, which is good. I also want to make the gravity a certain in the center. I want to make sure the gravity's in the center so the text shows up in the center. And I also want to change the text appearance to just be the default, which it is. I don't need any text inside here, so I'm just going to delete it because we're going to be filling in that text. And the material small is fine for the texty style. So let's add in another text view. It won't let me drag and drop it until I have another one in there. Let's also add a third one in there. And now I can resize them so that they show up correctly with the same width as each column. Let's make sure I have that selected. Let's try the outline view, it might be easier. Maybe we can make this bigger. There we go. And so I thought I got rid of the text view. Let's make sure I get rid of the text view again. And for the second text view, let's call this type text view main or table. We want to make sure that this has a width of 93, and we also want to match the parent. And for this, the gravity is going to be the left. We want to set the gravity left. We don't want any text. So let's add the gravity here. To the left. And then for the third one, we want to give it a good name and same IDs. We'll call this TV date time table. For the third one, we're going to have it be a width of 97. And we're going to wrap the content for the height. And then we're also going to have no text and center the gravity. Okay, so we're almost done with our first screen. We just have to add our button now, but our scroll view and our table row looks good. Last thing we want to do is add our button. So let's go to widgets, go to button. Let's add this below. We want to add this below the table layout and the scroll view. Make it a little bigger. For the button, we'll just have, we'll call this, let's see, let's name this add appointment button. And here the width will be 186 by 46. Just numbers I came up with that made sense. That made it look good. And I also want to make sure that my on-click method is add appointment button. And I want to add a new resource for the text. This new resource will just contain the add appointment resource. This will be add appointment. So now I have add appointment there, and I think everything else is good. The last thing we have to do is we have to infer the constraints. Let's make this a little more centered. Line it up with the grid. There we go. Let's infer the constraints. And everything looks good. Everything has constraints. We can ignore this for now. I just accidentally just build and clean. And everything should look good. Let's make sure that the XML looks good. So we have our 3 text views. We have our scroll view that contains our table layout. And our table layout contains a table row, and we have 3 text views inside of that. We end our table row and our table layout, and then we have our button, and then our scroll view. Oh, there's the problem. Our scroll view is not in the right spot. That's why it was giving an error. This should be ended outside of the table layout, just like that. And we don't want the button in the scroll view. And then that is about it. Okay, so now everything looks good. Our screen looks nice and neat. We don't have any real errors. These are some other errors about some suggestions to adding margin ends and so forth, but we're pretty good. We also have to make sure that our on-click was correct, or we didn't create our on-click yet, which we'll do in the Java source code itself. Well, let's go ahead and add that. So in the odd click, we're going to just double click that and add our on click. Okay, so now again we're going to be testing constantly. Now we want to create our second activity. So to create our second activity, we're going to go inside our app, make this a little larger, and we're going to go, really we can go anywhere. We can, might as well go in the Java source folder. We're going to right click, we're going to say new, and we're going to say new activity, and it's going to be an empty activity, and we're just going to name it add appointment activity, and we're going to leave everything else as the defaults. Say finish. This is going to create a new class and also a new layout file. First thing we want to do is we want to build our user interface. So we're going to go to our res file, we're going to go to layout, we're going to go to add appointment, and we're going to go to our design view. So this screen is going to need, first it's going to need an edit text, because this is where we're going to enter our name for the appointment. So we're going to select plain text. We're going to throw this in there. Try to format it a certain way, make it a certain size. Maybe drag it a little bit. Give it some good names, make sure it looks good. So some of the values we want to set for this are, give it a good ID. We'll call this edit text name. We're going to wrap the content for both. And we're also going to line that up a little more centered. And we're also going to make, we're going to have a hint instead of text. So we're not going to have any text. We're just going to have a hint and just say enter name. The text person name is going to be our input type. We're going to align the center, align the text. If we can find this attribute. We're going to do the text alignment in the center, right in the center here, and that's it. Next thing we need to add is our spinner, and so we can find that in our widgets spinner. We're going to drag this down. We're going to resize this to have a particular size. Probably make this the same size or close to it of the edit text. For our spinner, we want to give it some default attributes as well. Give it a good ID. We'll call this our spinner task type. Task appointment. We're going to make the width of this 200 dp, and we're going to make the height wrap the content. And we'll try to make this more in the center, the edit text. We also want to add our arrays. So before, when we did our spinners and our lectures, we added the string array in code. You can actually add the string array for the spinner. If it's static, you can do it right in the XML. So what I want to do first is I want to create a new string array inside my string resource folder. So inside here I want to manually add a new string array. So we can do that by just typing in a new string array. The GUI doesn't have any wizard for this, so I'm just going to add some items to my spinner this way. Now if I go back to the add appointment, there's an entries property where you can add your string array. So it's pretty neat, except it's not going to show up here because this only shows strings. It doesn't show string arrays. So again, we have to do this in our XML as well. So here I'm going to set my Android properties. And we could have done this in code if we wanted, but I want to show you how you can do it here as well. So there's a nice entries, Android entries equals add array, which is our resource, followed by task type. So this will populate our spinner. To go back to the spinner, we still want to add some more properties. We want to add the gravity so that it shows up correctly. Here we want to make the gravity center vertical and center, not left. And I think that's about it for the spinner. So now we can actually look at these errors. We haven't added any constraints yet. We'll do that in a second. We want to add a couple text views now. So let's go to our text. This is going to represent our date and our time. For this text view, try to line it up. We'll give it an ID of TXT. We'll show the date first, and then we'll show the thing. So we'll give this just an ID of text TV date. We'll make the width 200. DP, we'll wrap the content. We're going to make an on-click method for this as well, which we'll have to do in code because it's not showing up for inside there. So in our text view for date, we just have to make an on-click manually. And we're going to just call this edit text date. We're also going to set some gravity properties for this. When the gravity we want for this is center. As well. And we want to make sure this lines up somewhat appropriately. Make this a little longer. And we want to get rid of the text view. We don't need the text view there. We want to actually change, before we remove the text view, we want to actually change the appearance as well to make it a little bit larger. So we can do a search on this. Type in text and we can do all of them. Here we want to make this large. Go down to text appearance large, or make the size equal to 16 is good. For our other text view, we want to make it roughly the same. This is going to represent our date. For here, we can give it a name of, an ID name of text TV time. Sorry, I said date, but it's actually time. We don't want to have any text show up. It's going to be a large text appearance. For some reason there we go, large. That's the one I wanted from before. And we're also going to make an on-click method for this. We have to do that manually again as well. So for our second text view, we want to say Android on click equals edit text time. We're going to save that, and everything's good for the edit text. Last thing we want to do is we want to add our button, our two buttons actually, one for cancel and one for adding. So we're going to just drag this button down here, line it up, drag another button down, try to line it up somewhere. And for the first button, we're going to give it an ID button cancel. And we're going to wrap content for both. We're also going to set the gravity. The gravity we want to have be center. So center vertical, center horizontal, and center, that's good. We also want to create a string resource for this and do an on-click method. So we want to do an on-click, which will be button cancel. And we want to add some text, which we're going to use a resource for. Add a new resource. This is just going to say button cancel. It's just going to say cancel. So good there. For this other button, we also have to add the on click. We already had the on click. We'll add it to our code. And now for the other button, we're going to call this button add task. We're going to have it wrap content for both. We're also going to set the gravity and set it on click. The gravity is going to be the center, which is good already. We want to set the text. First we'll set the on click, the button add appointment. And we also want to set the text. So we got to create a new resource called button add appointment. And so we're good. I want to move this over a little. So it looks pretty good. Now we want to infer our constraints. And there we go. I did want to mention one thing is I added a new resource for add appointment, but we don't need to do that. We can actually reuse an existing resource because we have that same text already. So let's just reuse the existing one, which is this, add appointment. So now let's compile and run it. So it looks like it compiled everything okay. Let's run it on the emulator. Make sure it shows up okay. So here it is. Nothing is in there yet. The add appointment's a little low. When we hit the add appointment, nothing happened, so we can't see our second screen, but at least we're now on the right track. So let's just make this a little bit taller so we can see that a little bit better. And now the rest of the project will be implementing the Java source code. We implemented the two user interfaces. We've been testing and everything's good to go. So now we're ready to move on to the Java source code. We'll do that in the next lecture.